Hello and welcome back to our weekly conversations in English brought to you with the generosity of the American Friends of the Prado Museum. Today we're going to be talking about Anthony van Dyck, who was a child prodigy. He was the star assistant of Peter Paul Rubens, and who ended up being the principal painter for Charles I of England. And so he was such an important figure there for the very important tradition of British portraiture. And here at the Prado, we have an extensive collection of his early works. So we're going to see a few of those today. This painting, The Crowning with Thorns, was done when Van Dyck was just 18 years old. Now, the Prado had an exhibit called The Young Van Dyck a few years ago, and all of the paintings that were on exhibit there were actually from before the age of 22. Here we can see the label, so you can see the title and some information about the painting. So Van Dyck was absolutely brilliant from a very young age, and Alejandro Vergara, the curator of that exhibit and of this collection, he points out that this actually isn't so common normally, or at least it's not as common as it can happen in other arts. Normally a painter is better with age, and this doesn't occur very frequently in painting, that we have a prodigy so young like Van Dyck. He's really an exception, and I think he's aware of this in a way, because in his painting he intentionally inserts himself into a lineage of the greatest painters, or the painters at least that he most admires, like Rubens and Titian and Michelangelo. And we're going to see how he does that with this painting in a few minutes. So first, let's just see what he's painted here. This is a scene from the Bible, one of the events that's leading up to Jesus' execution. And after Jesus was taken in by the authorities, they put a crown of thorns on his head, both to inflict pain and also to mock him for his claim of being the king of the Jews. Another soldier is placing a reed in his hand to look like a scepter. They dressed him up in this tunic that has kind of a purple tone, which is another reference to royalty. So this is a moment both of pain and also of humiliation. It's in the beginning of what we know will ultimately end in Jesus' death. And this painting was completed in several stages, actually. Originally, on this side of the painting, there was another figure, one man standing that was dressed in an animal fur. And if we look close, we can actually see some of the pentimenti, or some of the details of the original painting that have been painted over, that become visible over time. We can see the foot of that original figure. And that original figure actually reminds us of another crowning of thorns that Rubens painted, where there was a figure just like that. At some point, Van Dyck painted over that figure, and then he added what we see here, this man and the dog, and then the people peering in through the window. But because we see that original figure, we know that Van Dyck, who was working side by side with Rubens, we know that he was looking at Rubens' composition. And so this really brings us to the topic of Van Dyck's influences for this painting, which is really what we're going to focus on today. And because this is his way, like I said, of weaving himself into this lineage, this genealogy, a heritage of artists that he admired. And the first is Michelangelo. These strapping bodies that we're looking at, especially the strapping bodies, the muscular men that seem like they're just larger than life. This characteristic monumental anatomy that makes us think of Michelangelo. Now, Rubens looked at Michelangelo for his anatomy, and so did Van Dyck, who was not hired as an apprentice, even though he was 20 years younger than Rubens was, but who worked in Rubens' workshop as an assistant. So Rubens looked at Michelangelo as well. And so Rubens, of course, Rubens is another influence. They were both in Antwerp together. Van Dyck was younger than he was working in his workshop, they worked side by side, so of course he learned from Rubens, and I think that's clear in his style that we're seeing today. And they were personally close too. This painting was actually given to him as a gift. Like I've already mentioned, the composition is based on a crowning with thorns that Rubens painted earlier in his career, when he would have been actually just a few years older than Van Dyck was when he painted this painting. And we can also identify figures that remind us of other paintings in Rubens, like this man here, makes us think of another figure in Rubens' Adoration of the Magi. If you don't have that painting in mind, then it's worth looking up to see, because there are figures in the front, right in the forefront, that are unclothed and muscular, that are very similar to this one here. And especially this detail here of the foot, this dirty sole that is facing the spectator, which is something that Rubens actually picked up from Caravaggio, and that Van Dyck here is picking up from Rubens. And Titian is another important influence here. We can see the influence of Titian both in the composition and in the handling of color. We already said that this is somewhat based on a composition by Rubens, an earlier composition by Rubens, but there's also an earlier crowning of the Thorns that Van Dyck was looking at, painted by Titian, that is now in the Louvre. And color. Color is so important. Titian is known for being a master of color, and especially in the way that he represents flesh tones, really making it come alive. And Rubens, and also by extension Van Dyck, really looked to Titian for his specialty in capturing the form of classical sculpture, but breathing life into it with his use of color. And if we think for a minute about Rubens' paintings, that I think that preoccupation makes sense with us, makes sense to us, that he's constantly trying to make this lifelike flesh, skin that really vibrates with energy, and so Van Dyck is doing that here as well. Rubens learned this from Titian, and Van Dyck learned it from Titian, and also from Rubens directly. So these three crowning with thorn paintings are related, and all of them are based on classical sculpture, which we'll see in a minute, but specifically classical sculpture injected, really imbued with life. And so the last influence that we'll talk about is classical sculpture, and specifically one sculpture group called Laocoon and his sons. And we can see that especially in this unmistakable turn of Jesus's head to the side. Now, very conveniently, we have a bronze bust of Laocoon here in this room to really show how that piece is related with Van Dyck's painting. So let's walk over there and see Laocoon. So who is Laocoon? Well, Laocoon was a Trojan priest who was warning his fellow citizens not to trust the Greeks, for anything, and not even a gift. And of course, they don't listen to him, and the result is the beginning of the Trojan War. Now, the gods who supported the Greeks sent snakes to kill Laocoon and his sons. And so you might be able to think of this image of a bust just like this one. This is part of the original sculpture group. It's a fragment of what is the original sculpture group. And you might be able to think of this image of this dynamic sculpture group with a large monumental man with two small sons being taken down by enormous snakes, and the three figures are twisting and writhing in desperation, and it's a very powerful sculpture. It's very expressive, and at the same time it's strikingly beautiful. And so the way that Jesus's head is pulled to the side in Van Dyck's painting really reminds us and he's giving into the pain and the inevitability of his fate, and the torsion, the strength of his neck really reminds us physically and emotionally of Laocoon. And the expression of Laocoon, let's look at his face for a minute. The expression of Laocoon has actually fascinated artists for centuries after as well. This expression of pain, but with an elegant dose of restraint, has just, it's left a really important mark on artists for centuries later. And the fact that we're looking at this man suffering, desperate, in pain, meeting his end, but we still admire the beauty of the scene is kind of interesting. And it actually makes Laocoon a great model for the figure of Jesus at the beginning of his torture and execution, both embodying pain and suffering, but also classical beauty and an undeniably beautiful figure. Now let's go back to our painting. Now, Pliny the Elder was a Roman author from the 1st century, and he described a sculpture group of that subject, of Laocoon. And so when the sculpture Laocoon and His Sons was found in 1506, artists were thrilled, thinking that they could connect that sculpture with the very one that Pliny was talking about. Michelangelo was involved with the identification, and it was a major event. It was exhibited at the Vatican, and so it was such an important event for artists. Laocoon is the source for Titian's crowning with the Thorns a few decades later. It's also the source for Rubens' crowning of the Thorns, and then in Van Dyck's crowning with the Thorns as well, that we can see here. And so when we see these references, we understand what a young Van Dyck is doing, which is inserting himself into this lineage of painters, of artists, of course with his own personal touch. And so I think that we should remember also when we're looking at this painting, when we see what Van Dyck is doing, and think of this painting not just as a piece of art for a minute, but as an object, and remember that this is a gift. This was a gift from Van Dyck to Rubens, and knowing how Van Dyck was inserting himself into that dialogue of classical sculpture, basing his composition on classical sculpture, but specifically how Rubens and how Titian approached classical sculpture, I think it makes it a really meaningful gift. Miguel Falomir recently gave a talk here at the Prado about Rubens and about Rubens' use of classical sculpture as a visual source, and he said that he didn't want painting to look like it was copying sculpture, but that the painting should reproduce the form that the sculpture was representing, and that when painting copied sculpture too much, that it smelled like stone. And the way to avoid your paintings smelling like stone, looking like copies of sculpture, was this use of color that he found in Titian and that Van Dyck reproduces here as well. And so Van Dyck would have been cognizant of this, would have been aware of Rubens' ideas about how to use classical sculpture as a visual model, and I think we're seeing that here in this painting, and it's something, and the fact that a young, brilliant Van Dyck gives this to Rubens as a gift, I think this makes it an even more special object in the collection. So thank you for joining me for our weekly Conversations in English today, and we'll see you again next Wednesday for more.